Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video I'm very excited about because I feel like it always creates a very fun discourse in the comments. That's right friends, it is almost the end of the year and that can only mean one thing. The Goodreads Choice Awards is upon us. And I'm going to be going through all of the nominated fantasy books and chatting through if I think they are worth or not worth the read. But before we dive into the books themselves, I do want to note a rather significant change that did occur this year for the Goodreads Choice Awards, and that is there's now a separate category for romantasy, which personally I will say I am a fan of. I really have nothing against romantasy. I read and enjoy romantasy, but I think as a fantasy reader in general, so I think it's fun that they're at least separated so we can have a couple different fantasy titles to chat about today. But I'm curious about y'all's opinions about that in the comments. Does it make sense to separate a subgenre from a primary genre? I personally don't know, and the lines can be a little gray and murky there, but nevertheless, we're going to focus on the fantasy category and go through all the books that I have read. With that in mind, there are 20 nominated books, and I have either read or read a part of 16 of them. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in because we have a lot of books to talk about. The first book that shows up on my scrolling list of books is Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. This is a gothic horror fantasy story, and we all know I'm a bit of a sucker for a gothic leaning story. And I will say the tropes and the writing of this book in general was something I really enjoyed. This is set in a very small town called Eden, and we follow our main character Opal, who hates this town. She will do anything to get herself and her brother out of this town for good. The only interesting and slightly different thing about this small town is that there is a house here which was created and once lived in by a very famous children's author who wrote like a very spooky book many years ago. Our main character Opal, though, is given an opportunity to basically work at this place called the Starling House and clean there. There she meets the warden of this house and things become very, very complicated. This book has a lot of discourse on legacy, particularly in small southern towns. It has a lot to do with generational trauma and being kind of stuck in a cycle of violence and harm. And ultimately, it's about a spooky house and second chances and people kind of finally seizing something for themselves. I felt like this book was really beautifully written. I felt like it took on some gothic tropes really, really well. I was endeared by Opal, our main character, and her sharpness. I feel like this book will cut you quite a bit. Overall, I found it to be successful. I would recommend it. It wouldn't be my favorite fantasy book of the year by any means, but it was one I enjoyed, and I will definitely read other books by this author. Next up, we have The Book That Wouldn't Burn by Mark Lawrence, and honestly, I was really surprised by this book. I hadn't read anything by Mark Lawrence until reading this book, and I was really captured by his writing style. It was more poetic and lyrical than I was anticipating. But transparently, this book has a rather vague synopsis, and I do feel like going in knowing as little as possible is to your benefit. But this is a story following our two main characters, a boy who has grown up trapped inside a giant magical library his entire life with his siblings, and a girl who grew up in a place called the Dust, surrounded by monsters and violence, taken one day as a small child, brought to the city where she then becomes an apprentice to a library. And the tagline of this book is, "The world has never noticed them, and that is about to change." Unexpectedly, these two characters come crashing into each other's lives, and also the setting of this book is this massive, giant, never-ending library. And did the author, Mark Lawrence, capture that feeling so well? I love fantasy books taking place in libraries, fantasy books about books, and that is definitely this, but just the setting, the immenseness of this place was just extraordinary to read. I loved the mystery and the murkiness of this tale. A lot of the experience of reading this book is just trying to piece together what in the world is going on. Where are we? Who are our characters? What is actually happening in this world and place? And what is up with this magical library? And I will say the experience was a riveting one. I flew through this book. I loved it. I loved the ending, and I can't wait for book 2. Then we have Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This is one of the first books I read this year and the first of Brandon Sanderson's secret projects released into the world, and actually one of my favorite Brandon Sanderson books to date. It was just so charming, so whimsical, and so fun. And in general, I just love stories like this. He often describes this as like The Princess Bride if it was told from Buttercup's point of view. It was just such an endearing Cosmere novel. In this book, we're introduced to our main character Tress, and Tress lives on an island with her family, and overall she would say she's happy. She's not really looking for adventure or change in her life, but everything changes when the love of her life is taken away from her, and she vows that she's going to go out there and save him. So she tries to do just that. So she sets out on something called the Sea of Spores. In this fantasy world, instead of oceans and seas being made up of water, they're instead made up of spores, which can spontaneously transform into a form of creation. It's very, very dangerous and very, very interesting. But Tress sets out into the wide, wide world, and she has a rat companion. She has to make friends and defeat enemies along the way. It's endearing, it's charming, it's fun, it's funny, and just absolutely whimsical. Who doesn't love a quest story? And I just loved Tress as our main character so much. I was endeared to this book, one of my favorite books of the year, one of my favorite Brandon Sanderson books of the year. I will say this list is hard to figure out what I would vote for, but I think this would be pretty high on my list of favorite fantasy reads. So if you haven't read Tress yet, I highly recommend it. Then we have The Fragile Threads of Power by V.E. Schwab, which I have not read yet, but I have read the original trilogy by V.E. Schwab. So I can say if you are interested in reading A Darker Shade of Magic, which is about parallel worlds layered on top of each other and different Londons with different amounts of magic, characters with endearing connections, sort of traveling between all of these worlds to try to save the world, I would recommend it. It's one I read many years ago and did really enjoy. I have The Fragile Threads of Power on my shelf. I want to read it soon. I haven't read it yet, so I can't technically vouch for this book, but if you're curious about the series overall, I can recommend the original trilogy. So I'll stop there. Then we have The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshni Chokshi, another absolutely mesmerizing, beautifully written story. Personally speaking, I love a book that feels both like a piece of myth. It has a sort of intangible, sort of timeless quality to it, and I feel like The Last Tale of the Flower Bride perfectly fits into that sort of essence. But the synopsis of this book is, once upon a time, a man who believed in fairy tales married a beautiful and very mysterious woman named Indigo. He is a scholar of myths, and she is an heiress of a great fortune, and in their agreement to be married, she basically said, "You are not allowed to ask me any questions of my past, of my family, nothing." And he readily agrees because he is in love with her. He's mesmerized by her. And for many years, they are happy until one day Indigo receives a missive calling her back to her family home because her aunt is dying. And once they arrive, questions and things from the past begin to unearth themselves, dark secrets and lost friendships, and a curse that ended in tragedy. I was really pulled in by this book. I really cannot emphasize enough how beautifully written it was. Roshni's writing is so well suited to adult fantasy. I love her middle grade books as well, but wow, this was just beautiful. I loved how much it felt like a piece of myth or like folklore brought to life. It was just so transporting and odd and strange. It felt like modern folklore, and it was great. The next book I'm going to mention is Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo. This, of course, is the sequel to Ninth House by this same author. A very anticipated release for myself and a lot of people out there, and transparently, I do feel like the sequel fell a little bit flat to the first book. It was by no means bad, but just in comparison to the success that I felt like Ninth House was, I felt like Hellbent, the sequel, was a little bit repetitive, a little bit long, a little bit drawn out, and really didn't push the plot forward in ways that I would have anticipated, especially from Leigh Bardugo. Conceptually, this series is a great one. It basically follows our main character Alex, who has a very complicated and dark past. And before the start of this novel, she is offered a job and opportunity which results in her traveling from her home in California to live and work on the Yale campus. She's now a student there, enrolled, but her job at night is to actually regulate and make sure all of the secret societies that exist on this campus aren't overusing or accidentally setting off some like dark evil power amidst everyone living in and around this area. In book one, there's a set of murders on campus that Alex gets pulled into. There's also a bit of a romance and just like overall an unlocking of lots of secrets of this dark, mysterious place. Book two is an extension of this, but I just feel like in comparison just wasn't quite as good or intoxicating as book one. It wasn't bad, but I would also say it was just okay. And with that in mind, I don't think it should win Goodreads Fantasy Choice of the Year, you know? Next, we have Swordcatcher by Cassandra Clare, and wow, was this book so much fun. And what's interesting about Swordcatcher, and just kind of brings up the questions I have for the separation of romantasy, I wouldn't say Swordcatcher is romantasy by any means, but it does have a steaminess to the romantic elements of the plotline. So I feel like, where's the gray area here? Like, what are the defining principles that make something romantasy or fantasy? I don't know, but let's talk about Swordcatcher. Swordcatcher is Cassandra Clare's adult fantasy debut, and I was swept away. This book was so entertaining, such a good first book in this series. I will be talking about this book a lot because I had a blast reading it. This book is set in the fictional fantasy world of Castellan, and here power and money rule the day, and powerful individuals are constantly looking for their next hedonistic thrill, if you will. I have to give a shout out to Cassandra Clare because both her politics and setting writing I thought were exceptional in this, and I felt very transported to the sort of city-state political scenario that we are dropped into. In this book, we're reading from the perspectives of our two main characters. The first is Kel, and Kel is something called a sword catcher. He was basically plucked from an orphanage at a young age, trained and lived alongside the prince of the realm to not only be able to impersonate the prince, but also to one day have possibly the opportunity to catch a sword for the prince and basically die for him. He basically impersonates the prince in like dangerous situations. The other main character we follow is Lynn, and she is a healer. She's also part of a cultural group that is completely ostracized, forced to live separately and follow a completely different set of laws and rules within society, no matter where they are in the world. They also have access to magic, the only cultural group or individual who has the ability to use magic in the entirety of this land. And Lynn uses her magic for healing. And at the beginning of this book, she kind of stumbles upon a magical object that alters the course of her life forever. And I loved it. I loved the politicking. I loved the character dynamics and the character pacing within the relationships. There's definitely hints at romance, but like, I don't really know where anything is going, but I can tell you I am hooked. This book was so entertaining. If you love Cassandra Clare's YA writing, I do really feel like you would like Cassandra Clare's adult fantasy writing. And I do feel like this is an interesting release that has the trappings of some great traditional fantasy, but is also pulling in some of the elements of what is so fun about romantasy in one release. And here we are, Sword Catcher, a blast to read. And the next book that's on this list is even more confusing if it belongs in romantasy or fantasy. It's a great book, it's a fun book, but romance is pretty central to the main plotline, and that book is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. This is a very charming and cozy read following our main character Emily Wilde, who is an academic, and she has spent her entire career kind of cataloging all the different fae tales and stories across all of the land, and she's finally almost complete. And at the beginning of this book, she's traveling to a far-reaching location to gather the last remaining stories for her encyclopedia. Unfortunately for her, her colleague, who she hates and who is also very, very charming in contrast to her difficulty kind of navigating social situations, arrives and sort of disrupts everything around her. This book, I think, is so fun. First and foremost, it definitely gives like Hal Sophie vibes from Howl's Moving Castle, the dynamic in terms of the relationship. This book is also very, very sweet. It's not very steamy, and the romance is much more paced out in that regard. But what I really appreciate, that while this book is definitely very romance forward and a very charming romance at that, it really does still capture a lot of the essence of fae-centered fantasy stories, like the fae history, the fae culture, the fae tales, the fae drama, and plot lines that are included within this are very well crafted and thought out. It's not just thrown in for like background plot, but instead included in a main part of the plot line too. But yes, I don't really know why like this would be in fantasy, but like A Serpent in the Wings of Night would be in romantasy. Because I also feel like that book has a balance of plot elements as well. But listen, I don't make the rules. I'm curious about it. All right, moving on, because we still have quite a few books to still talk about. We have The Will of the Many by James Isington, another book I've read this year that I loved so much and would definitely be near the top of my favorite fantasy releases of 2023. And trying to decide what I'm going to be voting for is very difficult at this point, I'm not gonna lie. But this is a Roman-inspired military academy set novel. In it, we're introduced to our main character, and he lives in a fantasy world that is very much structured after a hierarchy, again, inspired by the Roman Empire. Here, everyone has to give over their will to the empire, including all the lands that this empire has conquered. And the higher up you are on this hierarchy of people, the more will you're able to utilize and harness from other individuals existing in this empire. And our main character is a prince of a land that was taken over, and he refuses to give up his will in any way, shape, or form. And he's also trying to live under the radar and not be noticed by the empire. And unfortunately for him, he's sort of pulled into unexpectedly like a larger plot by one of the political factions that exists within this empire. And he's basically trained and prepared to be sent to this military academy, and he has to be a spy or all of his secrets will be exposed. From there, you see him not only have to work his way up in this military school in rank, he has to make friends, he has to make alliances, and also take on very difficult spy-related tasks for his benefactors. This book just has so many plot elements that make it so hard to put down, and the concept and the world is one that will really pull you in. And I just feel like the different scenarios that our main character is put in are just so complicated and like heart-thumping. It just becomes a book that you will just want to fly through. I also found the military school setting to just be great, and the character dynamics and connections fantastic. I really enjoyed the first one. It was riveting. It ended on an explosive note. It was just very entertaining and definitely one of my favorite reads, I think, for the year. So this one might get my vote, but I also love Tress and I also love some other ones I haven't talked about yet. But this again was one of my tops. So let that be known. The next two books I'm going to chat about that are on this list, I read and I thought they were both good, but in comparison to some of the other books on this list, I just don't think I personally enjoyed them as much as some of the other reads here. The first is The Unmaking of June by Adrienne Young. I really like Adrienne Young's writing, and I do think The Spells of Forgetting, her other release, was stronger than her newer release from this year. That being said, this book was still entertaining and conceptually like a fast read, but I don't think it's gonna like hold up for me as more time passes. Like, it won't be as memorable, if that makes sense. But this book is set in a small town and we follow our main character who lives and works on her family's flower farm. Our main character June has known her whole life that her family is cursed, and this curse basically results in all of the women in the family to slowly or very quickly lose their mind and their sense of reality. June has grown up knowing this was always going to happen to her, and at the beginning of this book her grandmother has actually just passed away, and she decides to take it upon herself to try to solve this curse and also figure out the disappearance of her mother, who left her when she was a small child. From there, we go on a very unexpected journey of like family and pain and love, and I honestly don't want to say too much because a lot of the experience of this book is reading the reveals of the story, and I will say it was creative and I liked the concept of the story and the writing was beautiful, as you would expect from Adrienne Young. I honestly just wanted more. I feel like it could have been so emotional and so impactful, but I think because the book wasn't so long, it just didn't sit as well as it could have. It was still entertaining. And I think if you like Adrienne Young, you would like this book, but it just wasn't my favorite of the books I've read of hers. You know what I mean? The other book that I read this year that I didn't love as much as I wish I did is A Day of Fallen Night by Samantha Shannon. I just don't love this series. The first one, of course, being The Priory of the Orange Tree, and A Day of Fallen Night is the prequel to this very beloved standalone fantasy series. I guess both of these can technically be read as standalones, but they are within the same series now, so you know, take that as you will. A Day of Fallen Night transparently had all the elements that I liked about A Priory of the Orange Tree and all of the elements I didn't like about The Priory of the Orange Tree. And I actually think Priory was stronger than A Day of Fallen Night, especially now that I think about it more. But this book is set in a fantasy world where there was almost a world-ending event by a very powerful, like, fire-breathing dragon. But the ramifications of the world almost ending by this very powerful dragon-like creature you see within the cultures, societies, and religions of various lands across this world. And in this book, you're reading from and experiencing the story from a variety of characters, all situated in different kingdoms and political locations across the land. They all also have different access to power, and they're all kind of going on their own journey to access and acquire that power in different ways. I find the concepts of this series to be strong, and I like Samantha Shannon's writing, but I also feel like some of her pacing personally for me is just off, and I also felt like this series includes a lot of plot lines that feel either unfinished or unnecessary or rushed to completion, which I don't really understand. I really just feel like this series, both of them, honestly, need to be like twice as long as they are, because I feel like the concepts are there. I'm just still a little iffy on the execution for me personally. Alrighty, moving on, we have The Adventures of Amina Al-Sarafi by Shannon Chakraborty. This book is a blast. Another like swashbuckling, fun adventure tale, and I would honestly put it in a similar category of like Tress, and if you like Tress, you should definitely pick this book up because it was a blast to read. In this story, we're introduced to our main character, Amina Al-Sarafi, who is a very notorious pirate, but she is retired. She's not really looking to head back out on the road. She just wants to live her quiet life with her daughter, until one day she is offered an opportunity and a sum of money she simply cannot turn down. So she is back out on the water again, and you see her begin to collect and bring the old band back together and set out on unimaginable adventures and take on unimaginable forces, and it's just so great. This book balances like the fun of a pirate adventure, seeing all of the things that this crew can take on now and also reflecting back on all the things they took on then is just great. There's so much found family in this book, but it also has some heavier topics too that are explored, and I feel like this dark and light is balanced to perfection. I had a blast reading this book, and I want there to be like 80 of them. I just want to read about Amina Al-Sarafi traversing the world and the globe, taking on all different types of magical creatures. I need it now. Speaking of found family and an unexpected adventure, we also have Witch King by Martha Wells. This is a fantasy standalone novel, which I do feel like is a little bit rare in the space, and I actually actually really enjoyed this book. I do think the plot and the world building is written in a way that's not so straightforward, which could make the reading experience of this book tedious to some readers. But if you don't mind kind of a heavy hand in trying to understand a world or how the politics function within a fantasy setting, and in some ways makes me wonder if this sort of world building style comes from Martha Wells' sci-fi background too, because it feels sci-fi-ish, where you're kind of just like confused and trying to figure out what in the world is going on. I personally liked it, but to take a step back, in this book, we're introduced to our main character, Kai, who is a fire demon who is trapped in a prison at the beginning of the story, and he is coming back to consciousness because someone is trying to basically steal his power. He quickly does away with this person who's trying to steal his power, and he realizes that he's been in prison for an unknown amount of time, and he doesn't know what in the world is going on at all. From there, he sets out into the world to try to get answers to these very pressing questions, and also try to save his friends, who also seem to be scattered due to some type of political maneuvering, which resulted in him being imprisoned in the first place. This book in some ways was a lot more lighthearted than I was anticipating when I picked it up. It definitely has a lot of found family and a lot of really lovely character moments and humor within the book itself. I do think the plot could read a little bit confusing. And a large part of this book is just trying to figure out what in the world is going on and what happened to Kai, not only in the present, but also the past. But a large part of this book is also Kai trying to figure that out too. So I personally think it works and I enjoyed this book, but I would say this is a book that I think is a little more hit or miss depending on the reader. Alrighty, and the last book that I can say I have read a part of this series is Bookshops and Bone Dust by Travis Baldree, which literally just came out. So I feel like I get a bit of a pass for not having read this book quite yet. But of course, this is the prequel novel to the very beloved Legends and Lattes, which is a cozy fantasy story following our main character who is tired of her life on the road as a mercenary, so she decides to set up shop and open a coffee shop. The aromas of the pastries and the coffee of this coffee shop will draw you in, and so will the friendships and the camaraderie along the way. I will be reading this prequel. I have not read it yet. It seems to be pretty beloved so far, but it did just come out. And if you like cozy fantasy or the first book, Legends and Lattes, like me, this is probably worth the pickup, but I haven't read it yet, so there's that. Alrighty, and before I finally say which book I will be personally casting my vote for, I also want to quickly run through the books that are on this list that I did not mention because I have not read them. The first is Victory City, then we have Stoneblind, there's also Inkblood Sister Scribe, which I own and have heard good things about and want to read, Venko Coven, which does sound rather intriguing. I love a witch-centered story, and lastly, two sort of Greek myth retellings. The first is Atlanta, and then Clytemnestra. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. Now moving on to which book I would cast my vote for favorite fantasy release of 2023. I will say the book I actually would vote for is not on this list, but that is a separate point. It's honestly hard to even make a short list because many of the books that are on this list I enjoyed so much, but I think the book that I would pick out of all of these books would be, at this point, The Will of the Many by James Islington. I just feel like the combination of the military school setting and the fast plotting and the great character work, I was emotionally invested, I was hooked. It just felt like a fun new series I can't wait to fall headfirst into. I was so entertained. So that would be the one that I would pick. But again, I'm sure as you can tell based on my description of many of these books, a lot of these books are great. So there's that. But alrighty guys, those are the books that I personally think are worth reading from the 2023 Fantasy Goodreads Choice Awards. Please let me know down below the book that you would vote for, as I would love to know. I am so curious, but I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon with another one soon. Goodbye.